Welcome, everyone. I know that this is a very large room for such a select group of people, very distinguished ones. This session is a special session that is designed to look at the question, or perhaps I should say, relook at the question of development. As you know, development is part of the very discourse of comparative and international education. So I think it's only appropriate that we consider the concept afresh, and I think that's what we will do over the next hour and a half with three speakers. We will look in particular the ways in which the notion of innovation is linked to the notion of innovation, and how new formulations and new configurations in and around the idea of development are emerging or have the potential to emerge. So I think at one level our session will look back. It will also look at what are the current conditions in which development has to be rethought, but also look in speculatively as to what possibilities and what potential exists around the notion of development. So that's basically what our agenda is, and we have three speakers, and I think we will get them speak in that order. The first speaker is Radhika Gurur from Deakin University in Australia, and she's going to talk about standardization, regulation, innovation, and development. Each of the speakers will speak for about 10 to 15 minutes maximum. So we have a great deal of time to have a conversation across the three speakers and myself, as well as you, of course. And that's why I actually asked people to be closer so that we don't need a mic for you to speak. Those people who are at the back may actually consider coming forward. So the first speaker is Radhika Gurur. The second one is Bjorn Nordtvig from University of Massachusetts in Amherst. He's going to talk about a title which is Otherness and the New Role of the Research University in Development. And then there will be Halta, and this is a difficult one, Holmatidottir from Oslo and Akershus University College, and she's going to speak on youth-driven innovation for social change. Diverse range of topics and themes, but all linked to the complicated relationship between the notion of development and innovation in education. So the first speaker, Radhika. I think you might have to, because we've got speakers. We've got listeners long way away.
Thank you very much, Fazal, for that introduction. I'm looking forward to this panel because this is one of the few instances, I think, where I'm not sure of what my other panelists are going to say. So it's going to be, I think because the range is so diverse, I'm hoping that we'll have a really interesting conversation across. Shall I come back?
Yes.
Over there? Okay. Sorry, I'm not going away. It's not stage fright. There we go. Can you hear me? Okay. So when we think of development, I think you can kind of broadly think of two thrusts which seem to contradict each other. The first thrust is that of innovation, innovation for development. And the other one is regulation, where you kind of try to bring systems into alignment and so on. So the question I want to explore today is, can these two seemingly contradictory thrusts actually, how do they work together? What's the relationship between them? And how do we deal with that, with these two opposing thrusts in the quest for development? So let's think about the first narrative, that of the role of innovation in development. So if you think of the notion that there are wicked problems and that incremental kind of systematic step-by-step kind of innovation is not adequate to overcome these kinds of problems. So if you want to, you need kind of really radical approaches which can sidestep or leapfrog things like lack of infrastructure and projects that can be scaled up immensely at low cost. That's the kind of innovation that is sometimes talked about as necessary for development. So for example, in India, where lots of people don't have even a landline connection, the use of mobile phones, for example, which don't require that infrastructure of landlines. We have all these assembly line type of heart surgery and eye camps and things like that in areas where there's no dispensary even, let alone a hospital serving that village. So in these narratives, innovation is presented as a kind of a rogue kind of thinking, thinking outside the box, as a radical departure, as a disruptive kind of thinking. In India, we also have this concept of jugaad, which is a kind of a creative, innovative kind of chewing gum and string type of approach to solving a problem. So you have, you kind of put together a quick getting around a problem in an innovative way. And so in these narratives, it's about destabilizing the norm and disregarding standards. India's innovation policy, actually, of 2013 highlights some of the key strategies that are required to foster innovation. And they are looking at not at the traditional, we need universities to have research laboratories, and we'll measure it through the impact of, citations and patents and things like that. What they're thinking about is actually how can you collaborate with businesses, how can you collaborate with other agencies and make a difference to the lives of those at the bottom of the pyramid. And so that's the kind of narrative that appears in the science and technology policy. In fact, I think for the first time, it's not just a science policy, it's a science and technology policy. So they look at the link between the two. Some of the famous examples in India are this thing called Chotu Cool. Chotu actually means little, so Chotu Cool, which is like a tiny refrigerator, costs $69, and it's portable. It runs on batteries like a computer. And those kinds of things where in areas where electricity is not continuous and disrupted. And so innovations like these are actually making a difference to people. You can imagine things like, keeping vaccines and things like that as well, not just kind of domestic use. So here there's talk about the local driving the global. Local innovations becoming scaled up, or it might be South-South collaboration. So it's kind of a departure from the old narratives of innovation. But there's also another narrative of innovation, because as romantic as all of those things sound, to do those things you require investment. And to attract investment, you require some kind of a stability or stable environment, something that's predictable and where people are willing to invest money. So if you look at the Global Innovation Index, they actually have indices such as the rule of law, regulatory environment, the electricity supply, the logistics. So these are all required for people to come in and invest money in innovations. And these evoke a rather different narrative to the one that we heard before, because this is all about efficient systems that work in a coordinated manner, in a predictable environment, and where risks can be safely taken. So this kind of an environment depends on standardization, it depends on calculation, it depends on measurement, and without the kind of orderliness, this kind of view argues, there is little incentive for investors, particularly from overseas, to invest in projects and create conditions for development in a steady and regulated manner. So where does this, how does this relate to education? Well, recently I've just started a new project looking at accountability practices that are being put into place in the pursuit of SDG 4. And in that connection, I've been interviewing a large number of people. In fact, all of last week I was in DC talking to people from various agencies. And some of the narratives I hear, and this is only the very start of my project, so I don't know how, to what extent I'll be learning new things and changing my mind about some of these things. But my initial response when I listen to the narratives is that of alignment. That's the big word I hear. It's about systems and structures being aligned in order for, governments and everybody down the chain to be held accountable. It's about kind of joint sector, the sector alignment, and it's about kind of coordinating all the actors together and so on. They're kind of narratives of clarity and transparency. This idea of funding, for example, based on results-based funding, or the World Bank and GPE working to bring various partners together. It's a story of alignment, and I'm not being skeptical about this. I'm just saying that that's the kind of planning that needs to go into the kind of scaled operations that they're talking about. And so there's a lot of kind of macro level stuff that is being imagined. So, for example, I was talking to one set of actors. They were talking about how they go into a country, they look at the curriculum that is used in that country, then they develop standards based on the curriculum, then they develop assessments attached to the standards, then they train teachers to use those assessments in formative ways to improve teaching. Now, that sounds really great, but you think of a teacher who has 60 or 70 students in the classroom who may be coming from very varied histories and backgrounds, where this kind of the standard that is imagined when placed into a totally non-standard situation may or may not work in the way that is expected to work. So the question then becomes, just to back up a little bit, when we look at the reviews of the MDGs, that was one of the big issues, was that there was a lot of investment, there was a lot of effort, but there's there were quite a few results, good results as well, but a lot remains to be done. So how do we actually make this sustainable, and how do we reconcile these two narratives, the narrative of systematic kind of coordination and the narrative of disruptive, local, small-scale events happening, innovations happening? So just to finish, that's a question I'm actually, I think, posing as much as trying to answer. A friend of mine actually uses an analogy which might be helpful. Now, he was talking about how flight, the technology for flying was invented a long time before flying became commercially viable. For flying to become commercially viable, it was not enough to have the technology. They needed to have airports, they needed to have runways, they needed to have air traffic control systems, which needed to be coordinated across many places. So a whole infrastructure, they needed to train people to do those things, etc. So a whole system had to develop in order for this innovation to actually become useful and usable in a kind of regular way, or to become scaled up in the way that it has. So perhaps these two narratives need to work together, that you need the small scale kind of disruptive innovations, but to actually develop new technologies, but for those to be able to work, you also need the systems to be developed that will allow these things to flourish and become scaled up. Now, whether the things that we're imagining already to realize SDGs, or rather SDG 4, before the system has developed, and to what extent that will be fruitful is, I think, what remains to be seen. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. The next speaker is Bourne.
Okay, thank you. My goodness. Yeah, maybe I should just leave it. Thank you. I'm quite happy to be here, and I have sort of this subtitle to my presentation: I am increasingly uncomfortable with myself. And I'm going to speak to you about that briefly. I have about 10-15 minutes here. I'm not going to focus only how uncomfortable I am with myself, but it's starting from that perspective. It's about the role of the research university in development, and by extension, I'm trying to make a critical autoethnography of myself, because I have been working in this field for maybe 15 years now, and I started with a slight unease, and that slight unease has become a greater uncomfort. The stories and feelings in terms of my engagement with the field that I feel I need to face to understand better both the field and myself and my relations with them. And I think maybe that journey could be interesting because it places myself and the situation in a larger narrative that I try to make sense of, not always not finding solutions. So my talk today would be more questions that I will have for you and what you think about them than coming with solutions. So basically, where do I come from? I am from the development business. I'm culturally with a northern background as opposed to from a global south in which I'm working. I have a UNESCO background, 5 years of field experiences in Laos. I have experiences from the Middle East, in Iraq as an education observer, and then experiences from Africa with the World Bank. Always positioned as the northern so-called expert working in southern countries, bringing in the gospel from the World Bank or from other organizations. And so I'm culturally defining myself in the development business as a development person, working with populations that I feel are marginalized and that the organizations from which I work feel are marginalized and should then so-called benefit from my presence there. So there's a double feeling here. It's not only the unease of working within these defined parameters. There's also the feeling that there's a need out there, so that I'm ultimately also maybe doing something good. So there's this dilemma of how to deal with this situation, how to bring about change, positive change, good change, because that I would like to contribute to. But then there's this unease in the power dynamics of this situation. So that was then. Then I was in the field for about a little bit more than 10 years, working as a practitioner. Then I got into what is called academia, first at the University of Hong Kong, later at the University of Massachusetts. And in a way, the opposition between us and them in the field became even more acute. It was like a third personality was added to this practitioner beneficiary duality. There was this third personality being monitoring and evaluation often, setting up structures, evaluating them, looking at them even more from the outside, even more from this expert discourse. And there's clear advantages to us in this. There's advantages. We are getting money for this. We are getting to travel. We are going to look, evaluate, and give some recommendations. So the unease that I had in the beginning at least, I was working there in the field, interacting, speaking in Lao, speaking the language, interacting on a daily basis together. We were working together on constructing stuff. As an academic practitioner, which is sort of the bread and butter of CIES to a certain extent, I became the third person in this uneasy marriage between the practitioner and the so-called beneficiary. Now I became the evaluator. And there's also a feeling of change in the field. I have a feeling that when I worked for UNESCO, it was less emphasis on the academic part of it, it was more a working relationship out in the so-called field. And there was lack of this emphasis on quality control, always quality control, and bringing in academia as part of this quality control. I have a sense that this has become more a center focus of the discourse right now, that we need more quality control. We need to bring in research universities. We need to bring in academic practitioners to come and tell the funder, come and legitimize the funder, not saying if the program as a bigger system was all right, but to measure the minute changes in the so-called intervention population. And I have recent work with a main donor and implementation agency being out to the field once every year, once every 6-7 months, looking at how things go. And basically what we did was separating the population into two groups, intervention and control, working on baseline, midline, and end lines. And this unease with the way that we're proceeding became at that point acute, and we managed actually to give feedback both to the implementation agency and to the donor that we felt this approach of working with intervention group and control groups, what are they getting in return for their services to us? And we started asking questions. But is that enough to alleviate the unease? I'm not sure about it. The field as a whole is moving to a more conservative discourse. The recent elections that we've been speaking about in the United States is showing also a move towards a conservative discourse, a discourse that I'm also uneasy with. And the development field in itself has become obsessed with the quality control, not with the look at the transformative potential of development as work. Is there a potential for reinventing oneself? We are speaking about problematizing equality in this conference. We have these grand narratives, but are we actually contributing to them? And that's the question that I'm asking. Is it we speaking to each other, having nice discourses, having a nice discussions, having a good time between ourselves, and then ultimately being paid by funding agencies to go out and continue a very conservative discourse that is becoming increasingly conservative as time goes by? So this is my question to you. Where are we as academic practitioners positioning ourselves in this? Where are we going? How to reinvent ourselves? And it's good to come here and get an energy kick by listening to amazing talks about what we should do, but are we really doing it when it comes to the actual funding and to the actual way the field goes to? So here I'll stop speaking about unease, and hopefully I've given you some of my unease, or even more hopefully, maybe you have some answers to me where I should go after this presentation. Thank you very much.
Our third speaker, Alta.
Yes, thank you. I'm going to read a little bit because I have a bit of a cold, so my memory is kind of foggy. So you have to excuse me. I don't usually read from my paper, but I will take the opportunity to do it at this point. I'd like to pull off, it's nice to come last because the other two have basically said a lot of interesting things, and then I can kind of pull off some of the points. And it's interesting to think that we didn't actually discuss our papers ahead of time, as our first speaker kind of pointed out. But I see that we had the same thought in mind. So I will talk about the wicked problems. I'll also talk about disrupting innovation. I'll also talk a little bit about the uneasiness, which Bjorn is trying to talk about and point out. And I think I will draw off on our last lecture in this room, the Neller lecture by Antonio Nova, because he talked about the role of comparative education and seeing through the eyes of another. And I think that was a really powerful way to kind of close off and think about what we are doing within ourselves, within our work, and within the society. So in doing that, I want you to kind of keep those points in mind as I kind of go through the points of my paper. Now, this paper is being drawn off two sort of projects that I've had over the last couple of years, and it originated from an EU application I did in 2011, which has grown into other very fun EU applications over the years, and looking at the role of youth and development. And from those, I've edited a book with a colleague 2 years ago, and now we're editing a second book looking particularly at innovation and youth. And so while we agree that globally innovation plays an important role in economic development, investing, I think, in young people and placing them at the center of sustainable and inclusive development, I think we can agree is equally as important. So youth-driven innovation for social change is increasingly being recognized as a potential for the development of sustainable strategies in tackling some of the most pressing challenges of our time. So in looking at the Sustainable Development Goals, for example, highlight the importance of developing skills of the labor force in order to promote or reduce poverty. Despite the recognition that innovation is a global issue, a 2012 OECD report echoes the traditional development discourse with regard to innovation. And I'm going to read a little bit from this report because it's quite interesting. So the report focuses mainly on low and middle income countries and argues that the, quote, building up of innovation capacities has played a central role in the growth dynamics of successful developing countries, and that innovation has the capacity to be built early in the development process in order to possess the learning capacities that will allow so-called catch-up to happen. Thus, the report views innovation in these countries as occurring in stages, not unlike those that we saw in modernization theory, as things happening in incremental stages, with the first steps taking place through the adoption of foreign technology. And I think this is really confusing and questioning for me, looking at a report from 2012 and having this kind of discourse running through the report. And I think it touches upon some of the uneasiness that I think Bjorn is trying to tease out. So as part of the challenge in this panel, I aim to which aims to problematize the development and innovation, I want to understand the concept of innovation. And in doing so, I try to move beyond the OECD's report and try to see innovation, which merely sees innovation as a traditional development discourse, and I want to problematize that, and I think it's really a more global discussion that we need to be having in terms of innovation. So first I ask myself, is innovation merely old wine in new bottles? So that's a question I kind of ponder as I'm doing this work with a colleague of mine. So for instance, innovation has been understood as breaking things, and it includes breaking down their components and thinking about what holds things together, how they work. The objective here is to do things in another way or in a better way, a different way. Innovation has also been defined in terms of flipping things, like the idea of the flipped classrooms. So innovation is then flipping or changing something in order to create or to do something new, to fix a problem, or to look at something in a new way. While the idea of innovation itself is not necessarily new, I think the ways that in which we frame the discourse around innovation are new, and it does open up a new way for thinking, even with regard to the old ideas in terms of innovation. So innovation has traditionally been viewed as a matter of research and development and commercialization, inspired often by managers of business, and is now understood as a process that occurs, though, across a wider economic and societal level. It's a global phenomenon, unlike something which the OECD report suggests is only for low and middle income countries. And while traditional innovation, or old wine as I like to call it, still attracts support, we're witnessing increased support for new sources of innovation. So some of these are, for example, crowdsourcing. This is a kind of new, open kind of innovation, or microsimulation. So for example, innovation can be seen as both a process and a product. And there are two streams kind of in the literature in terms of innovation that I've sort of been able to pull out. So the one stream explores the organizational and social processes that produce innovation, such as individual creativity, organizational structure, environmental context, and social and economic factors. The other stream, the second part, approaches innovation as more of an outcome. It manifests itself into new products, products that feature different production methods, and so on. So this branch of research examines more the sources and the economic consequences of innovation. But I think there's also a need for practitioners, policymakers, and funders to understand the difference between the process and the outcome dimensions of innovation. The need to understand how to better support and contribute to the production of increased and improved innovations. There's also a need for developing contexts which support innovation, as you pointed out as well. So in other words, we can think about innovation having to meet sort of two criteria: novelty, being something new, and improvement, obviously. So to this list, we could also add improvements in terms of sustainability. And Victor, I noticed in the earlier panel this morning, you talked about the challenges of sustainability in terms of the island states, and where we're also now being sort of the challenges of these areas, island nations, being affected by climate change. And we need to think about innovation in terms of this kinds of sustainability. So the sustainability is, we need to think of it more than just innovation. A more kind of social justice approach, I guess, to innovation is what we want to talk about. So in this way, sustainability involves solutions that are environmentally as well as organizationally sustainable. So innovation works over an extended period of time, but also involves various contexts that then moves us beyond the OECD understanding of what innovation should be. Sustainability also needs to consider the pressing global challenges, or as something which my colleague Sherry Bastian and I refer to as the wicked problems. So these wicked problems can be seen as increased urbanization, poverty, poor health, social exclusion, inequity, or inequality is the concept we're talking about in this conference, radicalization of youth, violence, civil war, and underemployment as well. So the SDGs highlight the need for a transformative innovation, which involves the questioning of how to use science and technology to meet the needs and address sustainable and inclusive solutions. It's particularly important to think about the needs to develop skills among youth, and which takes into account the reforms in markets in order to combat poverty in our societies. While innovation can bring about positive change and improvements, there's also, and create a better world, there's also what we would call the negative side of innovation. So in the short term, these could be unemployment in sectors that are experiencing rapid technological change, but also in the long term, it could mean better quality jobs. I'm not saying that it does, I'm just saying that it might. But also innovation may lead to destructive creation, benefiting the few at the expense of many others, leading to also low quality jobs and creating more problems than it solves. Furthermore, we need to also remember that many technologies are deeply implicated in the set of persistent environmental problems we have today. So while innovation is both a process and a product, there is the concept of social innovation, and as such, it's important to recognize that the process and the product, along with the diffusion and adoption and the ultimate creation by innovation, contributes to and we can think about a definition of social innovation as a kind of novel solution to societal problems that allow us to have more effective, efficient, but also sustainable and more just solutions. So overall, innovation involves creating a valuable outcome which can be economic, but also social. And I think we often overlook that social aspect of innovation and look at only the economic part. So according to the European Parliament, innovation includes 3 features: novelty, adoption, and outcome. So for the EU, innovation is viewed as a cooperative accomplishment involving a number of individuals. And I think within the field of comparative education, we've had several researchers who have problematized the simple borrowing and lending of ideas and solutions. And I think we need to remind ourselves of this as we're talking about innovation. So the future global agenda has to address strong sustainability challenges and facilitate transformative change at all levels, I think in all countries. To achieve the SDGs, there's the need to move beyond outdated modernization discourse and to work for a global interdisciplinary cooperation, and as such, a need to see innovation as a global issue and not an issue for some parts of the world and not others. For instance, we have youth-driven innovation for social change is increasingly being recognized as a potential for the development of sustainable strategies to tackle some of our wicked problems. Yet the literature on how to effectively engage youth and prepare youth to take leadership roles is very limited. More knowledge about what constitutes enabling environments which foster innovation and develop prerequisite skills in youth, as well as what approaches are more effective for engaging youth as architects of change is needed. And I think there's, just to close, I want to point out to a couple of things. There is the promise of, for example, frugal innovation. That's the development of reliable, low-cost devices specifically adapted to the needs of resource-constrained settings. I think like with your Chotokul, yes, I had it written down. So that's an example. And then, of course, we have reverse innovation, which is innovations adopted first in low and middle income countries and then being spread to higher income countries. And these are being more increasingly recognized as essential and moving us beyond the sort of modernization discourse of the past. So these are some of the things that we are trying to look at in our texts.
Well, thank you very much. I think I might actually start off the conversation here and ask a few questions of each other, and then sort of bring in other people into the conversation. And please feel free when you feel that you have something immediate to say, put your hand up, and I will not follow the order that I have already planned for myself. So it is not going to be teleological development, but a development that happens in a piecemeal and indeed Jugaadi fashion. Okay. Let me actually ask a question in relation to the idea of, I mean, I take the point that you've made, Halta, about old wine in new bottle. I think that really needs to be looked at squarely, honestly, and systematically, that particular question. The question that I've got is, despite all the criticisms that have been made from post-colonial theories, post-development theories, and others, of the notion of development, it persists. It comes back over and over and over again. The question that puzzles me, in much the way that Bohn is puzzled, is what explains this persistence, and whether it is even possible to imagine a notion of development that is delinked from the assumptions of modernization theories, okay? And whether we have become so imbued, almost ontologically, into the discourses of modernization that we can't even imagine beyond the development discourse linked to modernization, despite the 50 years of critique of development discourse. So I was wondering whether you could, this really requires speculation rather than any definitive answer, but I think your presentation raised that question for me about its persistence, what explains the persistence, and whether it's even possible to imagine something that is beyond a notion of development and innovation that is beyond the modernization theory.
Do you want me to?
Yes, please. You'll make any comments that you like.
I have to say that I've been teaching master students for roughly over 20 years, and I've been working in a program in comparative and international education. And I've had students, mainly our students have been international students from all over the world. And usually one of my first lectures is, what is a better word than development?
Yeah.
And I still have yet to find a good concept and a good idea. And we challenge ourselves. I've never liked the word, I've never liked the term, but students bring it with them. Well, in our developing countries, and I said, why do we talk about it in that way? What is it? How can we loosen ourselves from that discussion? I don't really know if I have the best answer, but this is something I've probably been tackling myself for about 20 years. And I just don't understand that, as the world is becoming more and more alike in some ways and different in others. I did my dissertation work in South Africa, and you have a very huge inequality in one country. And still we're talking about development there, but in some parts of the country, we are not talking about it. So I don't know. I don't think I have a definitive answer, but I think it's a concept, it's an idea, it's a challenge that I think we just have to keep talking about it.
Well,
and
it's not
perhaps
only
being uneasy and uncomfortable.
It's not only the term, but what the concept signifies also, So it's not simply a matter of finding another word.
No.
It's actually sort of
our
trying to think
mindset.
about the mindset, It's interesting. I actually did an analysis of the very famous post-development book by Arthur Chura, Escobar. And it's interesting. Towards the end of the book, he falls back into the development discourse, despite having a treatise and a very systematic analysis of what are the follies of the development discourse and what are the problems. So it actually says that we are embedded in something deeper than we realize. You wanted to say something about that, Bjorn?
Well, I keep coming back to the global political economy and basically the structures that we are, the economic structures that we are embedded in. And I think that we are reimagining great stuff. I think we're doing lots of postmodern imagination. I think we're fantastic. We had a whole conference on the concept of Ubuntu 2 years ago or 3 years ago in Washington. But the problem is the field as such is not becoming more Ubuntu. We're speaking about Southern theory, we're speaking about South-South discourses, but they again embedded in the same economic structures. China is doing South-South with other countries, but it's again a power relationship based on the same dynamics as you see between the northern, so-called northern, whatever, Western countries and the global South. So we are replicating and following in practice the global political economy, whereas we are speaking a lot about, great stuff, but how can we practice that? How can we somehow push the field into that, I think there is a great challenge and contradiction that many people obviously have raised and discussed and talked for years and years about, and still nothing is being done. Well, something is being done, sorry, but more should be done.
I actually want to suggest something, and I want your reaction to that. But Radhika, do you want to say something about this particular dilemma that I have posed?
I do, but I do so with trepidation because I have a feeling that I will not hear the end of it.
Oh, really?
In Arizona, one of the things that we had a panel on, I don't know how innovation came up. I don't think it was about innovation, but I said something about the obsession with innovation and why did things have to be innovative? Why did they simply not have to be good practices? Why did they have to be new good practices and so on? And in fact, that's how I think I got myself into this spot where I have to respond to your question and probably put my foot into it. But I grew up in rural India, and I grew up around sugarcane plantations. My father worked for a company that owned huge plantations, and so I grew up in places where I saw deep poverty at first hand. We went through long droughts and failure of crops and so on. So I think the reason why the development narrative persists to my, and this is not my field, so I don't, that's why I feel that I might be putting my foot into it. But I feel that poverty and health challenges and the lack of, basic amenities, et cetera, have persisted. Mm-hmm. And something has to be done to tackle that. And it's, in a way, I feel that, the kind of white man's guilt that I hear, mm-hmm. I can deeply understand it. But it's also, I think, a luxury, to even feel that. Because I think there are many people who are not able to worry about post-colonial theory because their very basic needs are not met. So that's my response.
Well, that's certainly. Let me actually go to beyond about what you just said. Let me present this to you. Okay, that you have identified 3 personas. There are in fact 5 personas. Let me actually add to those. Okay, so there is the us, the practitioner.
Thanks.
There is the them upon whom we are doing the development work. There is the evaluator, and I want to come back to evaluation. There is the designer of the programs that the practitioner is putting into place. They're quite often different people, not the same people, mistakenly so, because they don't have the experience. They're doing it in abstraction somewhere away. And then there's, of course, the donor with distinctive interest. So, those are the 5 actors, if you like, 5 stakeholders, if you like, that are involved in this particular equation. Now, you as evaluator and I as evaluator would have a great deal of problems, okay, trying to actually figure out the dynamics of the other 4, okay, as you're doing your academic evaluation and, exactly as you've articulated with those 4, across those 4 actors, because you have to actually keep in mind what the donors desires in doing the evaluation and not simply what the practitioners experience in the field, okay? The 2 things are not actually exclusive, if you like. Now, my big concern is whether the notion of evaluation itself is not partly the problem, that it's far too narrow, and it actually quite often avoids the very thing that needs to be tackled, and that's the morality of this relationship, and indeed the politics of this relationship. I think Holter is onto that. Basically, from what I hear, Holter is saying, by bringing in the social justice perspective, or indeed a quality control perspective, which has its own problems, as she's pointed out. But there is reluctance for us to actually engage with an ethical deliberation about the nature of this relationship as we practice evaluation in technical terms as to whether it recognizes whatever the goals are, rather than looking at the nature of the goals themselves. Would you say something about the ethical issues that are involved in evaluation and how they are often avoided?
First of all, I fully agree with the 5 persona positioning, and sometimes we are both designer and evaluator and a little bit practitioner, so it becomes a little bit mixed up, but I think you're absolutely right at positioning that. The evaluations are very technical, yes. They don't ask logic questions about the relationship between the 5 actors. They don't want that. They want to be, the donors would like to be legitimized in their actions. And government funders, donors actually say that. They want to make sure that the taxpayer is getting a return on their investment. And that has been said publicly, among other by DFID, started the idea of value for money. So it's a technical evaluation looking at investment versus improvement in whatever reading, mathematics, for each and every dollar put into it. And then to go outside of that and question the morality and the ethics, I think there's methodologies that have been created that could deal with that. Right now, I'm looking into with students transpersonal methodologies, which are scaring, very scary. I have a student here who is scared, hopefully with me, in studying that. And we're looking at the possibility of being transformed as evaluator, as a researcher, together with the transformation of the participant in this endeavor. So there's ways of looking at power that are just theorized for the most part. Sometimes they are implemented, and I think they could be looked at least for inspiration, maybe not to practice them exactly as they are developed in California as a center for these methodologies, but maybe trying to bring in some of this these different discourses into evaluation to make them more ethical, to make them less based on the technical aspects, but to get the donor on board in that type of evaluation, in that type of approach. That's another story. And that's where I'm going back to this economic structures that are governing the world. And of course, I agree that we should help. There is poverty and something needs to be done with it. But the way is like, how do we tackle these things? How do we go about it? How do we go about easing those tensions of unequal power relationship? And that's where I think there's a fundamental challenge.
It's interesting that the term evaluation itself has embedded within it the notion of value.
Exactly, yeah.
Evaluation.
Yeah.
Yes.
And yet we actually think about economic value,
Yeah.
and the technical values, but not ethical and political values often in the term So evaluation, the term itself actually invites us towards ethical deliberation and political deliberation, but we have actually purged that meaning out of the term evaluation. You want to say something, Radhika? And then Holka? You've been writing something down, so I've been taking notes. That you have something profound to say.
So a couple of things, just thoughts that occurred as Fazal and Bjorn were talking. One was that the power relation, the power relations is not just an issue of the people from the outside going to the situation that they're going to, but the power dynamics in the situation itself. I've lived in Nigeria, and you find that
Could you speak to that?
You find that the situations in many cases, of course, are caused by the very unequal power dynamic to start with. Poverty has got created because of that very thing. So it's not only this, but it's already going into a situation that's very complex to start with. The second thing that I was thinking about was the superficiality of the evaluation in often occurs because there is a complete kind of disjuncture between the way evaluators think in terms of how things happen, in terms of time. The temporal thing is completely out of whack because a lot of time, quite often it takes a very long time for things to occur, and things might occur in quite different and unexpected ways. But the evaluating tools are very, pre-prepared and are not understanding of the processes. And I agree that this, I think to me, the politics lies in, and actually punning on the word lies, in this very separation of the political and the technical.
Yes.
That the politics of technologies or of the technical are not actually recognized.
Sure. Halter?
I think I don't really, I'm just making interesting notes from my colleagues to add to my publication I'm working on. So I have the uneasiness concept from Bjorn, and I have some very interesting points here from Rutger. And I think I really think that we need to kind of, I think if we don't talk about these things, they just stay the same. And we need to challenge ourselves to continually having these kinds of discussions, to challenge, to shake ourselves up a little bit once in a while. And I really appreciate this panel to be able to kind of shake up the concept of development and innovation, and what does that mean for us, and how do we do this, and how do we envision it, and how do we try to have a more just society, not just globally but also locally, within our own small spaces, in a sense. Yeah, I'd like to hear from the audience.
Actually, just one last question that I want to ask, and then I'll open it up. The notion of help is fairly important one, and I think Radhika mentioned it, and then other people have, but I have to say that there is not as much work done on the notion of help as there ought to be. Okay, so for example, you can ask a whole range of very interesting and difficult questions and morally challenging questions about who is helped, how they are helped, with what motivations, with what kind of outcomes and over what period, okay? How is help, and who regards it as a help and who doesn't, So those are the questions that I think are really, really important, because help does not have self-evident meaning. It has meaning that has to be negotiated with whoever. And that raises the interesting question of partnership. In recent years, the term development partnership has become absolutely ubiquitous. It's everywhere. It's no longer I'm coming here to help you, or I'm here to be a development partner. And I have to say, I shake each time not the term used, development is used, because that has been used and criticized. It's the partnership that bit. Partnership on what terms, whose terms, and in what context, and against what set of assumptions. That becomes, do you have any ideas about this term in field you would have come across, the term development partnership? How do people interpret that? Obviously it's designed to actually sort of give some indication of equality of power, which isn't there. How do people feel in the field about this particular notion of development partnership?
Is it
Yeah.
me? I think there's a number of terms that are fairly scary, and partnership is one of them. And my PhD was on public-private partnerships, so I could talk about this for a few hours right now, without notes. But there was a book published a few years ago from an NGO speaking about the tyranny of participation. And I think it's we can also speak about the tyranny of public-private partnerships, or partnerships, not necessarily in the Yeah. So we have this forced partnerships. We have these forced participatory approaches where we go in, and I've been participant in this, unfortunately, where we go in and the funder is saying that, well, we have to set up a literacy course. And then we go in and say, like, we're partners in this, what are the problems in this community? And they say, we need a tractor, we need clean water. And we said, yeah, that's great, that's good ideas, but what about literacy? And then they say, nah, that's not very interesting, that's not very necessary. And we said, well, that's really good. That's really good, because that's really what we can offer. So these partnerships, or this participation, becomes basically us convincing them of the funders' agenda, because that's really what we can offer, and we don't have a limited agency in this dimension as well. And then it's the question of who are we partnering with, or who are participating? Aren't we just replicating other power structures in identifying the person that is so-called the representative from their side, and then we become some kind of middle persons in this dynamic of negotiation? And finally, who are then profiting, who are actually gaining from this strange relationship? For sure we are. Maybe also the ones that are participating or negotiating on their behalf. But who are the real actors in this dynamic? And I think that's a quite interesting analysis in itself that needs to be done.
Indeed. Do you have any reflections on the notion of partnership and development partnership? Does that go some way towards meeting your challenge for a more social justice orientated? Does it help?
If you ask me today,
Yeah.
I will say no.
No. On another day?
I don't think so.
Maybe
but
not.
There's a whole nother can
Right.
of worms.
Sorry,
with that.
Very briefly, I just want to
Could
say, what about the, I understand just to be provocative.
Yeah.
What about not helping, and the politics
The
of
politics
not
are not
helping?
helping, yeah. Well, that's absolutely right. I mean, I think to assume that it is possible to have separate lives and not be engaged, that is morally objectionable. Mm-hmm. Okay? So to say that there isn't a sense of responsibility by those countries with advanced economies, with surplus income, and interest of economic and political kind, that they shouldn't be helping, is not a morally sustainable position. Okay. However, the question then becomes, when you should help and how. Okay, rather than whether. And that's why the field is much more complicated. If it was, well, we don't do it, the field wouldn't exist. We just walk away, have parallel lives. We don't have the luxury any longer, if we ever had, of parallel lives.
Yeah. But I think now the intersections between those lives are being described in economic terms,
Sure.
and that's a bit problematic.
Yeah.
I think.
Okay, are there any questions that? Oh, come on, yeah.
Noah has a microphone.
Just.
Thank you. That was really interesting from many perspectives, but it was something I think when you asked the question, Faisal, about what is development, should we have another word, should we have another concept for development, I was reminded of a situation. I work around the Pacific, mainly, not only the Pacific. I have been an academic practitioner for a long time. I've worked with the World Bank, I've worked with ADB and some of the UN agencies, but most of my work I do for my home country, the New Zealand Aid Program, which is a small donor and quite most of the time quite easy to manipulate a bit to get practice that you have confidence in. But one of the situations that I was in that reminded me of what Saville was exploring with you, and it was probably about 25, 30 years ago, and it was a conversation between the American anthropologist Marshall Silence, who was, I think still is connected to University of Chicago, and a Tongan academic sociologist, Professor Epeli Ho'ofa, who is one of my big heroes, the late Epeli Ho'ofa. And they were talking about the notions of modernisation, evolution, all this sort of thing, westernisation. And I think Epeli made the point that people get confused about seeing people who come from traditional societies such as Tonga wanting to westernise and so on. He said it's not wanting to westernise. They want the tools of modernity to make themselves more like themselves.
Yeah, sure.
You know, now these are kinship-based societies. Another point I'd want to pick up on is that you can't go in and change people unless the people are part of the process or agree with the objectives. Mm-hmm. It's a relational thing. It's not partnership, be cynical about it. It's contractual partnership that the aid international development community talks about mostly. But that relational thing is really fundamental to what you're doing. And you don't go in there assuming that you've got the answer. Bjorn, I think you should just relax a bit. If you weren't doing the work, somebody who's not self-reflective would be doing it, probably. So that's fine. Just one other thing I was going to say, it's gone out of my mind.
Thank you very much for that comment. For those of you who don't know, you are one of the leading practitioners as well as theorists in the South Pacific region, and your work is much, much appreciated for the insights that you bring to the whole field. You know, in my part of the world, Australia and New Zealand, it's interesting actually how we should relax a bit, you know, rather than become over-anxious about the theoretical debates, especially in the post-colonial context, because we mustn't actually assume that those people who are being helped do not have agency. They do, okay? And they can fight back. And indeed, a student of mine is actually doing a project at the moment looking at how the entry of China in the South Pacific area is actually creating conditions that means that the Anglo-American world is not the only player in town, but there is another player in town. And how is it that being negotiated by the Tongans and by the Nauru people and by the Vanuatu's people in Vanuatu or Samoa? And I think that's really interesting. So he's beginning from the position of recognized agency. Okay, and that we are not dupes, we are not simply taking it all, and that's whatever you dish out. So I think that actually should be comforting, and but also that should instruct us to not suppress the agency, because that's what traditional donors have done, is suppress the agency and haven't allowed those voices to surface up. Do you want to say something? I mean, as a practitioner.
I think Victor has a comment.
Sorry, over there.
I wanted to make a comment that I enjoyed this panel, and I thought Bjorn was very open about the dilemma he's in. And I thought maybe I should try to offer some kind of solutions. And one of them was mentioned, an idea of power. A lot of our idea of power comes, including in political science especially, the notion of that comes from Machiavelli. And if you think about it, it's to enhance the regime. You do whatever you need to do that keeps the regime in power, so to speak. But the word power itself is problematic because it's like the word mana. It's a kind of a metaphysical term. We explain relationships that don't work, for example, based on someone bullying and abusing power, when actually bullying is a form of the use of power that can be sometimes effective. Partnerships are also defined as equal, but there's an agreement as to what the goal is of the partnership. When actually in friendship, for example, which is a very difficult term, there's no condition for friendship, and it can only be among equals. So you don't have a power relationship. If it becomes one, then the friendship disappears, so to speak. So if we talk in terms of power relationships. Now, when you talk about working in a political situation, polis, in a city, or community that's larger than just a small face-to-face community of a family, let's say, then you can say that, and there's a politics of family, and it can be found in, for example, Confucius, for example, and in which there's no notion of the idea of power, by the way. You can insert the idea if you wanted to, but there's no use of the word power, which is sort of Newtonian physics, which is sort of rather than quantum or relativity. But the notion of power is important, but it's something that we accept, even in a field. We always talk about the power of Cold Wars and that kind of thing, and the power of the teacher and so on. Sex harassment issues are power issues, for example, rather than abuse of a relationship, which is a way of avoiding the use of power maybe, but the word power is so ubiquitous, and I've written papers on this, by the way, and I've come to the conclusion that one of the problematic words in education is the notion of power, and defining things in terms of power, which is also related to use of money and so on. Now, in terms of how to get a better identity, one may be to question terms. I think you've done that, the semiotics of a word, and whether some words are really kind of metaphysical, they can't really be proven. They can be proven true by the use of it, but you can live in a world without that word, or what the word might be. Now, the other thing that's interesting to me is that innovations created civilization. So, and one of the most important innovations was the domestication of plants and animals. And of course, this led to numeracy, accounting, and development of mathematics and science, and agriculture, and cities, and power relationships based on ability, money, slavery, and so on. And at the same time, it's also meant, ultimately later, the development of schooling.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Yeah, but I wanted to point out that one more important thing is that if you think about it, many of the important innovations came before literacy. One was cooking. We kind of overlooked the fact that cooking for human beings became very important. And if you think about Paleolithic men, human beings.
I think we might get there.
Yeah, but I'm trying. I know that, but I wanted to. No, but the point I'm trying to make is that the arts became important in stabilizing the crisis of the inventions. Okay, and the arts requires a personal agency and ability to innovate and use an innovation that is pleasing not to just a self but to a community, which is the case of the Chauvet cave paintings.
Thank you.
And the point I'm trying to make is that a recent scientific discovery.
She wanted to say something. She's trying to say.
Yeah, I know that, but I would like to just say one important point is that there's a recent paper written by a whole batch of Paleolithic archaeologists who studied the Chauvet art. and found that the art lasted for millennia, same style of art. And people who were artists were also the shamans, the leaders of the community. But, I know, but the point I want you to make is that, one point is that the changes in art came very fast with the start of the agricultural revolution, and have speeded up in the last century.
Okay, thank you. I think you don't want to come, but that was a talk. Do you mind if we?
I just have a quick question. I'm Sarah from Michigan State University, and my question is, as we talked about the agency of the people who are there in the developing countries, as we say, also what do you think of the agency of people who are working in development world, in developing in these organizations? People like you who are talking about these things, and especially your role and how we are moving from this point on when we are really critically problematizing all these issues, and what alternative we have to move on in future. Also keeping in view the rapid changes in especially India and other part of the world in terms of technology and development also. Thank you.
I don't know that I have a very direct response to your question, in part because I've not been somebody engaged as a practitioner in a development agency. But in terms, I think one of the things that I in retrospect, find that I never actually addressed in my talk was this notion of practices, and how when you actually examine practices, you'll find many of these kind of narratives or categories, and the things that the plans actually are always exceeded, that they're never contained, and people work things out. The narrative is never as stark as we make it out to be, and the relationships that, for example, the things that Bjorn has been worrying about are never as straightforward in that sense of that there is a power flowing, like the power relationship is not that kind of. I know of situations where communities get aid from agencies for a particular purpose, but they know that actually they would rather use it for something else, and they satisfy the requirements in a checkbox kind of way, but they do the thing that they think is more meaningful to them. So I feel that those are always very fluid. And for the project that I'm thinking about now is really looking at practices of accountability and describing those. And I have a feeling that when I start to do the ethnography on that they're actually going to look very different to the kind of, the tidy checklist that we are preparing for that.
Bjorn?
I think I like the term fluidity, and I don't think it's useful to say that there's no agency, there's lots of agency, classify it. There's negotiations between actors. There's local agency for sure. To which extent is that constrained by donors' parameters? To which extent are we as academic practitioners or whatever we are constrained by those parameters? To which extent are we able to navigate those discourses? So this agency in small amount at each level, and I think this is one of the most amazing things with being in this field is that, despite the unease, is the privilege that we have to have whatever small effect on actual policies, and whatever small thing we can do to help social justice, help promote equality and less of these power dynamics, and to ease those constraints. Thank you.
Any other questions? There we go. Is that your student?
Hello. Hi. So You talked earlier about sort of the different roles, the donor and the practitioner and the academic and so forth. And I'm actually wondering, I was at a different panel earlier today, and I'm wondering about the role of the activist scholar, or the scholar activist, and sort of how that might fit into sort of the terrain. And I think that ties in with sort of this social justice theme that's sort of cropping up. So if you could speak to that particular role.
Do you want to say something?
Well, actually, I think Sahara just added one category to your list. So the activist scholar. So maybe you should take up that.
I have to say that this is going to be a limitless list, basically continue as we identify new actors within the terrain, which is kind of understandable. But I think it is really interesting question about the activist, and who the activist is being an activist on behalf, because it is possible to be activist on behalf of the donor as well as from the if you like, the subaltern, the marginalized. I have come across activists who really are doing legitimation work within the communities in which they are working. I'm thinking here of Frantz Fanon's work about the native elite, and the kind of activist work that they do, is a very different kind of activist work than I suspect you have in mind. You're talking about Arundhati Roy kind of activist work rather than the work of that native elite. But I think they are to my mind, they perform a very, very important role. Even if they don't only have half understanding of the processes, they are the moral conscience, of the process. And they are the ones who can highlight questions that need to be asked, even if they are misleading questions, even if they are ill-informed questions. They're nevertheless interesting questions because they open up the terrain against the technicist view of evaluation. And I think in that sense, they play a huge role. And I actually think it would be a good idea to have over the evaluator another evaluator, if you like, an evaluator of the evaluation or the evaluator of the evaluator, keeping them in check as an activist. Sorry, over there.
Thank you very much for your talk. My name is Ferdaus. I'm a student in Masters in Development Practice at the University of Arizona. I was really interested to learn more about the reverse innovation. There's no doubt that science, technology, and innovation plays an important role in the developing world. What is your suggestion to the donors and decision makers to lead this to the developing world and help this happen in the grassroots level in the developing world as reverse innovation and bring it back to the policy? It means we should understand where it is needed and how we can help the people in the community to be involved with the decision making through innovation. Thank you.
Did you get this one?
I think reverse innovation.
Reverse innovation.
So you were talking more about the idea of the reverse innovation in a sense, and what we should, how we can promote reverse innovation? Yeah, so I mean, that's an interesting, the colleague I'm working on this book, her name is Sherry Bastian, and she works at the Norwegian University for Life Sciences, and she's been working with Masai in Tanzania for probably 10 or 15 years. And she has a very interesting project, actually, which takes on this idea of reverse innovation. And it sprang out of actually a challenge that she had with the project. So I'm going to use this as an example because I think it's a great way to think differently about innovation. And it's this flipped kind of thinking about innovation. So we were doing a book project, her and I, and we had a writing week in Morocco, and then she was going off to Tanzania after that. And she had to bring all this equipment with her because it's a water project, just looking at water sanitation. and she brought all these microscopes that she had gotten donated. But when she arrived in Tanzania, first of all, there was a lack of electricity. We've heard that already today. Half of the bulbs in the microscopes were broken, and many of them didn't work. And she was really challenged with this idea of you know, how can I do this sort of, it was doing a science fair with young people and trying to learn how to you know, have clean water. So she actually contacted a group of scientists where she had heard that they were using something called fold scopes. Now, I don't know if anybody's heard the concept of fold scopes, but they are basically microscopes made out of paper, and it's based on the idea of origami. So, you know, the Japanese folding of, and these are very interesting. They're flat packed, they ship easily. She can put 2,000 in her suitcase if she wants, as opposed to maybe 20 microscopes, which weighed a ton. So, and I think thinking about how to do things differently, but that are effectively and economic. And I think those fold scopes could actually be something that then children in my part of the world, I live in Norway, could actually use in a science fair. They're inexpensive, they're easy to transport, but we're testing and then using them out then in Tanzania. But the idea actually came from something very artistic and very creative. So looking at how to combine and do things, I guess it challenges us to also think more across fields, and that we have to look to other areas of research, how science and technology or arts or the sociologies or humanities can work together to solve our challenges. And I think that's where we need to kind of move beyond our academic walls.
Well, I think we've run out of time, so I want you to join me in thanking the panel, please. And thank you very much for participating as well. Thank you. That was good, actually.